to Roland now. I think you're still on mute there, Roland.
Can you hear me now?
Gotcha. Yep.
I think. Can you see and hear, which is kind of the basis, right?
Yeah.
So thank you for the invitation and great to talk about some of these things. What I want to do is cover essentially three things. Let's see, why doesn't this work? Yes, I can't really see you because everybody's off screen, but it's not such a huge group. So, really do, interrupt and ask questions, which is much more fun for me and for you. So, and if you disagree with something, that's even better. But since I can't see you, maybe, Isak, can you kind of monitor if somebody is too shy to interrupt or something, if there's something in the chat so we can get a bit of discussion going?
Absolutely. Yep.
So, so three things. One is, as Isak said, a case study. And it really, the whole story is about complexity and public policy, right? Is how do we make what we know about complex systems and complex system science relevant to change something on Monday morning that was not changed on Friday before, right? So it's really to try to have practical stuff happen in the world. And so there's a case study that I'm intimately involved with that I just wanted to describe, which is about methane mitigation. And then just a few slides in the middle of, a reminder and grounding on complexity, which, most of you won't need, but it's just quickly to make sure we align about, what I really mean by that. And then there are I've got a number of stories from the various books that I wrote on other examples on complexity and public policy. And depending on how we're doing on time, I can go through more or fewer of those. And then there is also, as in the invitation, there's perhaps the intriguing prospect of figuring out what stuffing zebras has to do with complexity, and a lot, actually. That's another book I wrote. So I'll come back to that at the end. But the case study, the example I want to describe is a thing called the International Methane Emissions Observatory, and this is under the UN. And it really is something that I'm the founder and the initiator of this thing. And as you may have seen, those of you who in my background, I'm a physicist. I worked in industry it was like a 25-year internship, about half of it at Shell. I was the head of the LNG business at Shell, which at the time nobody knew what LNG was, but that appears to have changed. As now it's in the newspaper every day. And I left about 15 years ago and, started writing and, advising partly on methane issues because, as you will know, methane is the component of gas, right? It's the biggest component of natural gas, which is what goes into LNG. And then and life has strange turns and twists. I had the opportunity to create and propose this institute called the International Methane Emissions Observatory. There was no institution globally that dealt with methane. And it is now 7 years later, we raised $100 million and there are 80 people working there. And it is the institution that deals with methane emissions. But apart from that, really, it was an opportunity for me, and as the Americans say, to eat your own dog food. And how do I to create an institution that is founded in the principles and leverages the principles of complexity and complex systems. And that's really why I want to tell you the story. The climate change angle is interesting and all that, but it's really the complexity and policy angle. Just very briefly, an introduction, because you may not all be familiar with the story of methane, but so methane's a huge issue. And it has some peculiarities. It's responsible for about a third of global warming. So this is a big deal, right? This isn't some sort of secondary effect. And the other particular thing is that the quality of the data that we have is terrible, which, by the way, is true for a lot of climate issues. Because what happens is that the data is estimated using standard factors, which are defined, but very little is actually measured. And of course, the engineers on the call will know that if you don't measure something, you don't know how much it is. Knowing what the average emissions of a particular object are is pretty useless. You need to know the specific emissions of that particular thing. And so the quality of the data is terrible. It's a huge issue. There are lots of cost-effective solutions, but very little action. So in many ways, a great opportunity, and one that's been underwhelmed by the attention on CO2. So before we get into the how, just one other thing which is starting to get into this complexity dynamic. It isn't about the gas, right? There are 6 different socioeconomic systems that generate methane. And if you think about how you change something in the world, you actually don't change the behavior of the methane molecule, right? That has no agency over itself, over its own emissions. You have to figure out what is the socioeconomic system that I want to change. And there are 6 here that are dramatically different. There's the oil and gas industry, which embarrassingly loses something like 3% of the gas that it produces. There's metallurgical coal, which goes into making steel. There's thermal coal, which goes into coal plants. Landfills, the big trash heaps, and that's essentially rotting, organic waste in these landfills. Livestock, and particularly cows, belch. They don't fart, is a big misunderstanding. Well, they do, but not lots of methane. And so when they digest grass, etc., they belch huge amounts of methane. And rice fields, you have rotting leaves and herbs at the bottom of these wet rice fields that rots and emits methane. So there are 6 sources. And this is really important, is that in this kind of superficiality of policy world, is people want to lump things together. Oh, it's about methane mitigation. But if you take something like coal, mining and mitigating emissions from thermal coal and metallurgical coal is exactly the same. But it's a very different socioeconomic system, right? One is a strategic mineral that goes into steel making, that goes into electric cars and construction and all sorts of things. And, companies with a future. And thermal coal is largely owned by private equity and is essentially bottom feeders waiting to get closed down. So a very different set of incentives and industry dynamic. And so it is about understanding the system and taking the perspective of what is the system we want to change. And the fact that they have the same gas coming out of it is kind of not that important. And so what you need for each of these systems is a theory of change, right? How is this thing going to be different after I intervene in it? And there's this sentence at the bottom, is that if you analyze, so repeating a desired outcome doesn't make it happen. If you look at a lot, the overwhelming majority of statements and stuff around climate change, it's all about what we would desire, the desired outcome. Companies should do this, governments should do this, consumers should eat less meat or drive electric cars or God knows what. But that's really not that interesting, right? The question is, how to make that happen, because the what, in particular in climate change, is not that hard. We know exactly how to fix climate change. It's not a great mystery. There are 4 or 5 things we need to do. The much harder thing is how to get them done. And theories of change come roughly into 2 buckets. There's the sort of top-down approach, which is, force people through regulation, call to action on people with authority to do something, define best practice and get people to comply with that. So there's this whole school of people who, do that. Then the complexity literate amongst you, which I think are all of you will recognize, and you can take this from an agent-centric perspective and think that, who are the agents of change, who actually needs to do something, and what network unites them or connects them, and how do you change the behavior of these kinds of networks? And then you get into stuff like Elinor Ostrom, polycentric governance, etc. It's stuff we know, but quite different from the, top-down authority-based theories of change that are on the left. And the third thing is you really have to think this through for every system, because it's always contextual, right? Who needs to do who needs to take action and how. And the what in reality is most of the time really not the problem. The who and the how is specific. And in those 6 different systems, they're dramatically different. Changing the behavior of cows and changing the behavior of oil and gas companies has nothing in common other than the gas that comes out of it. And so you need a completely different theory of change for each of those. So this International Methane Emissions Observatory has as its mission statement or whatever tagline, which is below the title here, is IMEO exists to provide open, reliable, and actionable data. And this is important because, as I mentioned, the quality of the data is lousy in this whole space. But here's the key thing, is to the individuals with the agency to reduce methane emissions. And this was a big fight, I can tell you, because people want to say to those with the agency or to those who can take action, etc. And, we had endless discussions. And I said, no, this is really about figuring out who has agency. But literally, which individuals are they, right? Because people say we have to talk to CEOs or to ministers. Well, ministers or CEOs actually don't eliminate methane emissions. They're influencers, right? They might have authority or something. So they're part of a network that gets to the actual individuals who need to change the emissions. And so it's this discipline of thinking through the theory of change down to the person who, again, needs to take an action on a Monday morning. And you really have to think about that individual, but also how different they are, because individuals and systems are very, very different. And what I found, certainly in the climate space, but I think it's true in most policies, people just don't, have the discipline to think this through to the end of, who do you want to take action and reason back from the individual, as opposed to sort of vaguely say, well, let's change the rules and let's, create awareness, let's do engagement. And all these things are great, right? There's nothing evil about engagement and awareness raising. But unless you're able to figure out, how does that lead to change at the scale that's required, you haven't finished your homework. So let me give you an example of how this worked. So the out of the 6 sectors that I mentioned before, so oil, gas, met coal, thermal coal, landfills, livestock, and rice, we started with oil and gas, and there are a number of reasons, is that it has, everybody more or less agrees, it has the highest mitigation potential, which means that we know the solutions, the capital is there, people know what to do, etc. So there's one particular thing that is also attractive about mitigating oil and gas, which is at the core of the theory of change for this sector, is that the companies in the oil and gas sector, and here are several hundred, are networked together through a network with high eigenvector centrality. And, to those whom this seems technical, it isn't. It's absolutely essential, right? We know from complexity science that networks, the structure of networks, they represent the structure of complex systems, and they're the key to understand how they can change. And so in this case, high eigenvector centrality means that there are a number of companies that are at the core of the clusters. And the oil and gas industry is kind of weird because in order essentially to share risk, this is all about financial risk. The large assets are typically co-owned by a number of companies. And so what we drew is the network of ownership, the ownership relationships between all of the oil and gas companies in the world. And so there you see where the hubs of influence are. And unsurprisingly, it's the companies well, right? It's the Shells, the Exxons, the Totals, the Eni's, et cetera, are actually the connecting fabric of this global industry. They're not very big, right? Exxon and Shell each produce, less than 1% of the total oil and gas. So they're quite small, but they're immensely influential because at the heart of these networks. And so when we wanted to create a framework for these companies to change, it was critical that we exploit this network. So what we ask is that companies that signed up to reduce their methane emissions commit to also reducing the methane emissions in all the ventures where they had a small share, because that meant that this network needed to come alive and it would percolate and the action would propagate across this network. And again, I dwell on this because this isn't a technicality, right? This is at the heart of the theory of change, because this meant that we knew how to get from, talking to a few people, early movers, et cetera, to getting to the mainstream of the industry. And this is where we are now, is that, IMEO is the hosting institution, as I described. It's essentially a catalyst in a larger methane ecosystem, right? There are lots of organizations involved. I don't want to imply that this is the only one by any means, but it's really the core one. And the program I described on the previous slide is called the Oil and Gas Methane Partnership 2.0, OGMP 2.0. And that currently assembles about almost half of global oil and gas production. And so that's not small, right? This is an enormous industry. And we now have, I think, 150 member companies that represent almost half of global production. And these companies now share a language about, they commit to reducing their methane emissions, they commit to measuring them, they commit to reporting them according to standard frameworks and improve the quality of their data over a number of years. So this is a multiple-year framework. And so the tool is measuring and reporting, but the goal is creating cultural change across the industry, so that this becomes a norm, a social norm in the industry, that you could be forgiven for producing a fossil fuel, perhaps, but losing 3% of it on the way to the market is kind of embarrassing. So that's the foundational thing. So we use this industry structure, this eigenvector centrality, and have created a partnership that exploits those network properties. And that is what enabled us in about 5 years to reach, almost half of the world production. And it's accelerating now. I mean, others will continue to join. Now, people continuously say, well, but it wouldn't be easier if governments would just regulate this and force the industry to do this. And yeah, but this is one of those statements where you say, sure, but it's just not happening, and it's not going to happen because the industry essentially has enormous power in most countries, and will just make the regulations go away. And this is exactly what you see. The US had pretty reasonable methane regulations, and of course they've disappeared. So OGMP is the foundation for the EU methane regulations, which are awesome. I mean, this is subject of a different seminar, but they are really extraordinary. But it is founded on OGMP. It's because we did the work and we got an industry consensus around, this is a reasonable thing to do, that the European Union was able to build on that and start creating a regulatory framework. Now, it may get lobbied away, right? But then we will still have this partnership approach of OGMP. So this this was a theory of change that was based on the particular structure of the oil and gas industry. The next thing that IMEO is targeting is steel, so not very well known, but methane emissions in the supply chain represent about a quarter of the climate footprint of steel, and they can be mitigated at less than 1% of the cost. So really cheaply, you can make steel 25% cleaner. Again, most NGOs would say, well, but we should really go to full green steel. Yeah, again, I agree that would be wonderful, except we're not, and it costs 50% more, so it's going to take decades to get there, and immediately you can reduce the footprint by 25%. But this is harder because the companies do not have high eigenvector centrality, and they're not networked together, so it's a lot more difficult to get to scale. And if we get to some of the other problems, rice, for example, rice farmers, you're never going to be able to change by talking to them and creating a partnership of rice farmers. They're probably the only solution is to have, agriculture regulations, because there really isn't the degree of agency in that particular system to be able to get an agent-centric theory of change. And I don't want to dwell on each of those, but really the lesson out of this, I think for me, is that you have to design your theory of change from the particular structure of the system, the degree of agency, the power dynamics inside of it, and then customize a theory of change that fits that particular topic. So I want to move off of methane, but just want to make sure if there are any questions on this. It's a slightly rapid overview, but anything anybody wants to dig in on methane before we move to complexity and then other examples?
There is one question here from Anna. I'm not sure if you'd like to chime in, or I'll just read it out. Happy either way.
Yeah, happy to chime in. Yeah, I was thinking, Roland, yeah, it's very interesting, this case. I had the opportunity to work in the oil and commodity industry, how challenging it can be to change their mentality. And you worked across six different areas. I was wondering, how was it to get the buy-ins? Was this work commissioned, or you really had to figure out what they valued in trying to pitch the idea and get the buy-in for each of these industries?
So again, it's one at a time, right? And the approach for every sector is completely different. So in oil and gas, we've had big success, and now moving on to the other sectors, which are harder. But in the oil and gas industry, I know very well from my days in Shell, and the idea is to create a value proposition that works. And so we started with the companies with high eigenvector centrality, but also leveraged their institutional investors. When companies were reluctant to join, because their sustainability managers advocated this, we've literally, in some cases, called up some large institutional investors that we created relationships with, and they called the CEO and said, "You'd better join, or else we'll divest." So there was a mix of, you really should do this, it's good for your reputation, etc. Together with, as usual, sometimes you just have to flex some muscle. In the early days, we used the American ambassadors, who were incredibly powerful. When they sent a message to a company somewhere in the world, that they would typically sign up. So it was a mix of, just generally convincing people and also using power levers. But again, that works in the oil and gas industry, right? If you think about rice farmers, is a completely different system, and you need to rethink the thing literally from absolutely zero. So that's my main point, right? Is that that theories of change are dependent on the system you're trying to change, and you will have to look at them through a complexity lens. Does that answer your question, actually?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
All right. So the second thing already on time. The second thing I said, it's just a few slides on complex systems, which apologies for those who are completely familiar with that, but just a quick reminder. And then I want to go through some examples from each of my books, simply because I think they're also interesting examples. So the first thing is just, I always think is a fascinating thing. How many cells do you think you in your body have in common with other species? So I don't know who has a dog, but think about your dog, and how many cells in your body do you have in common with your dog? So this isn't molecules, right? It's not, it's literally living cells. And people generally, because we can't do this interactively, I'm assuming that people, unless they know the answer, are generally stomped at this. And it turns out that about 50% of the cells in our body are not human, in the sense that they are not derived from the DNA of your parents. And so we're half not human, right? And a lot of those non-human cells we have in common with other species. Here you have a graph of the degree of commonality. So how distant other species are to us. So dogs are closest, and chicken apparently further. Who knows? Who knew? And so where are these cells? This is your gut biome. It's all the cells, all the bacteria and viruses that are in your gut and on your skin, etc. And if you just count the number of cells in your body, that's half of them. And we used to think, in the good old colonial days, that these were kind of slaves that worked for us, is that we humans had all these viruses and bacteria that did stuff for us, digest food and do other things. It turns out that it's a lot more complicated, right? They really interact. Part of your health depends on the health of your gut biome, etc. But this is one of those examples, a bit like the methane mitigation is, how do you conceive when you talk about me, right? What do you think of, right? And when you go to the doctor and you say, I am ill, the first thing the doctor could say, well, you just mean the human half of you or the other bit? What are we going to be treating here? And so, for example, every time you get antibiotics, you've chosen for the human side because you're killing off most of the other half. And so these are big gambles, right? And so I think the big aha, this is just an example, one of the big ahas of complexity or system science is, you really need to think through about, what is the structure of the system that we're dealing with? And we tend to take real shortcuts on that. And as you will, the word complex, you may have a complex relationship with your brother-in-law or with your boss, but that is a completely different meaning, literally has nothing to do with the meaning of complex in complexity science. Because plexus in Latin means to braid, and think of these images of these wonderful Nigerian women with extraordinary braids. And complex means with braids. And so complexity is the science of braided or interconnected systems. So it is about, like these bacteria, it's about the interconnection that driving the behavior of the system. And the opposite, of course, is reductionist system, whereby we assume, well, things may be connected, but if we just think about them separately, then we're not too far off. And so I always encourage people to think of complex with a big C and a small c as having completely different meanings. And in many conversations, people mix them up because we have this emotional sense about the complex relationship with our boss that literally has nothing to do with complex systems. And so unless you're really able to segment those, it leads to a lot of confusion in my experience. So very briefly, complex systems, one of the characteristics is the shortest description of the system is itself. So you can't reduce it, right? You can't summarize it. So if you think about a tree, so I'm looking out the window, that's why I'm looking sideways. The shortest description of a tree is literally the tree, right? Where the leaves are, etc. That's the only thing that completely describes that particular individual tree. You can describe the generative algorithm, the underlying structure. So the underlying structure of a tree is grow, split, grow, split, grow, split, make a leaf. So there's a principle, but with so much statistical variation that in the end you create this totally individualized object. And so that's the formal description of complex systems. One of the really important things about complex systems is only complex systems have resilience properties. Non-complex systems are not resilient, do not have the properties of resilience. So since resilience has become a bit of a fad, and I'll talk about it later as I wrote a book about resilience, you cannot understand resilience without understanding complex systems. You just can't get there. So that's really critical. And a lot of the sort of superficial stuff on resilience, in my view, strands there because you don't go to the full complex systems reality. You can represent complex systems as interconnected networks. That is a way of representing them. And the picture I had earlier of the oil and gas industry as a network with high eigenvector centrality is an example of that, right? Is network mathematics allows you to study the structure of a complex system. The other thing is that averages are not helpful. I always encourage people is, as soon as somebody comes and tells you, well, the average of something is something, is to immediately, your first reflex should be, they're hiding something. Because what characterizes complex systems is the diversity. It's the deviations from the averages inside the individual agents, like the leaves on the tree. That's what characterizes the system. With the averages, you sort of you take the life out of the system. So averages are totally unhelpful. They have non-Gaussian statistics. That's another side of that. There's a wonderful article in the Harvard Business Review, which normally is not always as great, but that basically argues we should leave Gaussian statistics behind us. The tragedy is that most of us have had, largely only Gaussian statistics in high school or even in the early years of university, and none of that is relevant. Right? Gaussian statistics are not what describes the world, and also, complex systems are everywhere. And where are they? The human brain's a complex system. Maybe 20 years ago we thought that feelings were in one particular area and willpower in another and language in another lump. And it turns out that isn't true. It's all distributed, and understanding the relationship and the network in the brain is what is starting to unearth how it works. The economy is a complex system. The great tragedy of particular macroeconomics, and I hope there aren't too many macroeconomists on this call, I don't want to tread on their toes, but the deep existential tragedy of macroeconomics is that it starts by postulating that the economy at a macro scale, micro is different, at a macro scale is not a complex system. So it has representative agents, it has perfect rationality, and it has general equilibrium, which are exactly the things that drive complexity out of the system. And that's one of the reasons that disciplines in particular crisis. Traffic is a complex system. It's actually one of the areas where complex systems modeling is standard. There are very few. It's one of the areas where people have really accepted that it's the interaction between vehicles that determines traffic patterns and not the average flows. Social networks, social media, everything that has to do with genetics and biology are complex systems. Animal flocks, when you see bird flocks, the shape is a perfect example of a complex system. As some of you will know, it's also the cliche of complex systems. There's a really wonderful design studio in the Netherlands that has done these projects at Burning Man and in Saudi Arabia, and even here in Amsterdam above the A. with 400 drones that are programmed with just the few rules that people assume that birds follow. And then drones are able to flock autonomously perfectly well. So, essentially, complex systems are everywhere, and the opposite to complexity is reductionism, whereby you think you explain the behavior system from its bricks, and where in complex systems you look at the emergent pattern and the emergent architecture, and that's what you're looking for. And in many policy problems, you're actually interested in changing the emergent behavior of a system. What the individuals do doesn't really matter that much. So if you want to eliminate smoking or reduce eating red meat, for example, you don't really care whether a particular individual smokes or somebody has a huge barbecue. You're interested in how the collective social properties change, not so much the individuals. So that's my super rapid fire overview of complexity. And let me just go through a few examples from each of my books, and then I guess we'll.
We did have a couple of questions, Roland, from Evelyn. Is it? Have I pronounced that properly? Yeah. Would you like me to read those out, or you're welcome to jump in?
Jump in, Evelyn. It's more fun to hear from you. With all respect to Isak.
Yes. Yeah, I had a few, but first of all, yeah, I'm trying to capture the way you see the complexity, and I had some questions about that also. But first of all, if you are talking about the theory of change that depends on the systems that you want to change, how can you determine or say what is in the system at the first place? Because when we look at, for me, when I look at a complex system, you have the ownership networks and the financial exposure and everything, but how do you decide what is in it and what is not? Because for me, it are like a little bit different kind of systems that need maybe all another theory of change. Or for me, it's like you're building a kind of frontiers or borders around the system, and it's difficult for me to see where do you put the borders. Excuse me. Yeah. I hope I'm.
No, it's a very clear and very important and legitimate question, right? So, but the first thing, as with my methane example, is to figure out, who are the agents that you're interested in, right? You're not trying to create a theory of everything of the world, right? You're trying to do something, right? And so in this case, I want to change the behavior of gas plant managers who are able to order a valve to be replaced or some operational process changed. So those are the agents. And as you know, a complex system is built up of agents. So birds from bird flocks, traffic from cars. And so the first question is, who are the agents what are the agents that I'm interested in here? And then you figure out, well, what is it that influences them? It could be from other systems. It could be, there's all sorts of stuff that surrounds them. But there's one really fascinating thing about the world. There's a friend of somebody in Australia who calls this the rule of hand, is that in complex systems, social systems, there are a maximum of 5-ish influences on individual agents that matter, often less, but no more than 5. And the deep reason is that if there are more than 5, you can model that systems become unstable. If they have too many interconnections, they're unstable. And so there's kind of a Darwinistic thing in the world that systems that are with too many interconnections disappear because they can't survive. So long-winded answer is, my recipe is, number one is figure out who the agents are that you're interested, and then model your system or think of your system about what are the 5 key influences on those agents, And the discipline to have is, if you were going to create an agent-based model of that system, how would you program it, right? You know, how many agents do they have? How are they interconnected? And what influences act on their particular behaviors when they make a decision? That gets you a long way, in my
But
experience.
then if you say, okay, I understand about the 5 agents that you say, yeah, that matter, but that, for me, in my eyes, it's like if there are more, it's more dynamic, so it's difficult to capture or measure,
Well, you have to
but that
figure out
doesn't
which
mean that they
matter.
are not there and they don't have an influence. So, but
But do
yeah,
they have
but
influence?
I see your point. I see your point.
I mean, do they drive the emergent behavior of the system? Because that's what you're trying to change, right? So if you look at something like solar panel adoption, right, is that it's pretty well modeled that, you know, the price of solar panels matters, but not that much. It's actually a network problem, is that people copy the behavior of other people who take solar panels. And so what matters is the degree of social trust, the degree, you know, their position in these social networks is more important than price. Price has a little bit of influence, but not major. And so very often there are only maybe two things or three things that matter to the behavior of these agents and how they can be changed. And there may well be other things that somewhere have an influence, but if it's the question is what are the things that really drive the emergent patterns and not things that, you know, have some connection. So you have to sort out which ones are the things that matter most. And typically through interviews and people who know a system very well will have a good sense of that.
We also had a question from Kim. Just jump in. Sorry, just
Yeah,
jump
sure.
into the chat. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Isa. And thank you, Roland. Really, really interesting to hear this case study and your perspective and experience on it. And I also really like that your approach here is sort of going through the emergence and the foundation space. It feels it's less direct. It's more about, you know, the condition. I think that is absolutely the right way. But my question is, because you talk about theory of change, and I think that's very, very important. We need to elevate the idea, the concept of theory of change. It needs to be more alive and more adaptive. And I think more actors need to have a relationship to it. But what I didn't really catch is, what is the link between the theory of change and the actual system that will do the sort of the deployment or the coordination of the interventions, all the changes that needs to happen throughout the whole system? How is that? Is there a link? Is there a system of intervention that is created? And if so, what is that link?
Yeah, so, you know, to be practical, if we go back to the story of oil and gas methane, is because, you know, I had this theory of change around the eigenvector centrality and the way all of this works and the need for data, etc. Is, you know, the next thing was to design a framework that would leverage all of that, right? That would leverage the connections and would leverage the need to get better data. So we created an institution, a partnership structure that was intended to drive that change. And then, you know, we also got lucky, right? You know, managed to raise 100 million and parked it under the UN and all of that, right? So, you know, none of that's trivial, but but it does. But the core of it is having an idea of how do I want this thing to change, and therefore how can I create an institution that will leverage, that will implement that theory of change. But you have to design it's kind of an institutional entrepreneurship, right? You have to design the institution that does that. And you're not always able to do that, right? I mean, I was in a fortunate position that I could, but that obviously doesn't happen all the time.
Yeah, okay. Just a quick follow-up, because I think that was interesting, because then basically the system that was sort of tasked with delivering on the theory of change that you created was the institution itself. But I feel that is, I mean, even if you get $1 billion, to have that institution is very top-down, shouldn't the intervention strategy be more? I mean, it's obviously important to have sort of a unified institution, but that can help with the coordination. But shouldn't the intervention strategy in this large systemic issue be more distributed? So it's I don't really like the word portfolio, but a more clustered distribution of different kind of strategies over time, if that makes sense.
Well, so the institution is catalytic, right? Is you need to have something that calls up people. It's not at all top down, right? Because it's entirely voluntary and people sign up for stuff, but you have to make sure the data is sorted and properly represented on a web. I mean, you need people to do kind of coordination.
Yeah, of course.
But it's not top down at all, right? It's totally distributed in that all of the action is taken at the gas plant level, right? That's where the action happens. The institution doesn't do anything, right? It just facilitates the process. The doing is somebody who gets up in the morning and says, I'm going to remove these methane molecules from the air. Right? And that is totally distributed to the edge of the system, as indeed it should be in a complex system.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Sorry, maybe the top down wasn't really the right word.
That's
maybe
fine.
Centrality was it. My thinking was, if that institution is gone, what happens to the intervention? But thank you very much. I think I got what you said.
By the way, that's a good question, right? Is if the UNEP messes up the institution, or which the UN has been known to mess up things, but does the initiative survive? I don't know, right? You try to get as far as you can. You hope you've structurally changed the industry, but you're never sure, right?
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, shall we just look at a couple more examples and then?
That'd be great. Yeah, thanks, Roland.
So my first book was a thing called Complexity and the Art of Public Policy, and we chose the art quite consciously, and it was about solving society's problems from the bottom up, together with David Collender, who's passed away, was a wonderful economic historian. And there are just a few highlights from each. It talks about the curious story of economics, and economics matters because a lot of our policy narratives are derived from economics. So people talk about, all sorts of concepts from economics make it into our common language. But as I mentioned before, there's a tragic assumption at the heart of economics, which is that the economy is not a complex system. And that is just flat wrong, right? It isn't even an opinion matter, is that, it's demonstrably wrong. And that, has an enormous influence on how we think about the world. So, there's a good chunk of this book lays out why that is a real problem, and why complexity literacy is really understanding complex systems, particularly for economists, is incredibly important. And one of the examples, which we amongst many that we discuss in the book, is we've designed institutions, the institution of the corporation, right? A company, every country has laws about what defines a company, and we just assume a company is a thing. But, this started actually here in Amsterdam in 1602. People created the first shareholder corporation. It was meant to solve a particular problem, which was the risk on colonial goods coming from Indonesia, to be able to share risk across that. And that institution has evolved over 400 years, and it's what we now accept as being the company. But as any institution, there are certain emergent properties associated with it. And we argue in the book is that the consumerist society that we have may well be associated with the choice of institutional structures that we've made. And so that, the encouragement is, we should think about reinventing, or at least adding more options to the structure of the corporation. And it's something you understand as a complexity thing, is that, structures cause emergent properties in society, and they aren't neutral. And so this is one of the cases we make, and we go through a whole bunch of examples. But this was the first story I had on complexity. And basically, one way of summarizing this is you can look at, problems from education to, healthcare, whatever, immigration, through an economics of control frame, through this top-down, you need to control and regulate. Or you can look at it through a market fundamentalist frame and saying, market forces will solve everything. Or you can look them through a complexity frame, which is, as we've discussed, these issues of agency and emergence, etc. And you literally see something different. You get different policy options. And the task for policymakers is to say, well, what's the right frame for this problem at this time? And I have to always repeat it twice because people will assume because I'm a complexity guy, I'll think the complexity frame is always the right answer. It actually isn't. But the skill to be able to judge what frame to apply to what problem, which was a little bit like my methane story, is that, for certain systems like rice, you probably need a control frame. Whereas for oil and gas, you need the complexity frame. And so the ability to choose the frame and your theory of change that's associated with it is, the argument in this book is what the critical thing is. So there's another book here on resilience. And as I mentioned before, only complex systems have resilience properties. And there's a curious thing is that resilience and efficiency are most often a trade-off. So you can make something very resilient and it'll be less efficient, or you can make it very efficient and it'll be less resilient. And most losses in resilience are unintended consequences of increase of efficiency. And this matters a lot because we live in the church of efficiency, right? If you ever in your organization try to argue against efficiency, people will be horrified. But it's really important to understand that in a complex systems perspective, you can't have both. There are systems that are inefficient and not resilient, right? But they're just stupid and badly designed. They do exist. But assuming something is reasonable, you can either optimize efficiency or resilience, and there's a trade-off between both. And understanding that trade-off is critical. So again, this is one of those insights that complexity brings. Another book I wrote together with Angela Wilkinson here at Oxford was about scenarios. So Shell, as you may or may not know, has used this approach of scenarios to understand, to think about the future. And so this isn't about predicting the future or assigning a probability to the future, but thinking about what the plausibility of the future, of different futures is. And I think of this as a social method, an on-ramp to complexity, right? It's a way in an organization to make complexity discussable if people don't have the discipline to understand network mathematics or agent-based models, etc. So it's a way of, in the real world, of socializing the fact that there can be different emergent outcomes. And without using all these complexity words, the scenario methodology is a way of engaging the people around you in complexity. Just two more books, but there's another one with a publisher, but won't be on this list. So I wrote also a book about climate policy revolution, which this methane story, in a sense, is an illustration of. And this is about, how, what catalytic measures are able to create non-linear change in terms of climate performance. We're past linear change, right? We're just too late. 50 years ago, we would have had the time to make gradual changes, but no longer. So we need to have catalytic change, and it does exist. I mean, if you look at the explosion of electric vehicles over the past 12 months or something, with great thanks to Donald Trump, actually, who's really been helping promote green technology. That there are these nonlinear changes, but there are others, right? Autonomous vehicles, for those who are interested, direct current networks is something that in China is a big thing, and a little bit in Europe, which enables you to move current around and load balance across a continent, which is underutilized. And I have a chapter also on the legislation of psychedelic substances, which, are demonstrators, Imperial College and another university have done these trials, is that, demonstrably the use of single use of psychedelics changes your affinity with nature in a dramatic way. And so the argument is, the basic premise of climate policy is that you have to care about nature in the first place, right? Or else we're never going to do anything. And yet the one set of substances that, make a step change in this, we forbid. And, there's no overdoses, it's not addictive. I mean, there's really zero risk. And so it's a very diverse set of interventions, but they all in this complexity frame look at nonlinear changes. And then finally is our story of the zebra, and this is the last book I wrote, which has the odd title "Falling in Love While Stuffing a Zebra." And the fundamental idea about the zebra is, so this is about the 18th century, right? Is in the 18th century during the Enlightenment, we fumbled complex systems thinking. People were by and large systemic thinkers in the world, not everybody, but it was pretty mainstream. And during the Enlightenment, in the hurry to find an alternative to reveal truth, we settled on a very strict linear logic and reductionist kind of thinking. And I wanted to explore that. I wondered whether, so the book set in Paris in 1786, and I got people debating about these issues around the cafes and with silk dresses and dramatic hats. Whether anybody at the time said, well, wait a minute, this is kind of dangerous what we're doing. We should be careful to adopt this reductionist thinking because it doesn't do justice to the world. And inevitably, there were people who said, well, you have to be careful. But nevertheless, over the past 200 years, we've settled into this pattern that proper thinking is reductionist thinking. And that is what, the people on this call, if you want to be systems thinkers, you have to realize that you're rowing against 200 years of history. But nevertheless, during the Enlightenment, we changed our style of thinking and we can do so again, but it's not a small tweak. And the zebra finally is an image in this book, is that it turns out that, zebras are untamable because they're basically nasty animals because they're lion fodder. And so they've evolved to bite and kick and be really nasty, or else they get eaten. Whereas horses, galloped through the steppes and were happy with their friends and ate some grass and have wonderful characters. But in the 18th century, people wanted to domesticate zebras because essentially they wanted to put them in front of their carts at court to drive around because it would look cool. So you had all these, in this reductionist thinking style, you had all these generals who said, well, I can dominate horses, I can dominate zebras, and they would get bitten and kicked. And so essentially it demonstrated that reductionism didn't work. And, one of the plots in the book is that in the end, they have to, the taxidermist has to stuff a zebra, and that's another way of, reductionism wins because you manage to finally get control of the zebra. Anyway, it's a bit of an artifact in a book, but it's this image about the fight between systems thinking and reductionism, which in a sense was settled in the late 18th century, and we live under the shadow of that today. So that's what this book is about. And it was I could have written a very heavy philosophical boring book, and I thought this was much more fun. So that's what I did. So that, let me stop there and turn back to the screen. Stop share.
There we go. Thank you, Roland. That was excellent. And we were getting questions regularly throughout that, but I just wanted to get to the end of the books in particular because I knew the zebra was coming up. But just trying to happy for anyone to jump in here, but we certainly have Joel has asked a couple. Anna and Kim, Evelyn, I think as well, jumped in again. So perhaps Joel, you haven't spoken yet. Would you like to jump in with your question?
Sure. I don't know that I necessarily have a question, just trying to acknowledge that the complexity is the lens we use, and narrowing that lens helps us better understand which systems we're interacting with, and that all of these things are interrelated, almost in an autopoietic kind of sense, with natural systems theory and this idea of our cells being shared. I also like to think of our neurons in our brains are similar, and there's almost this universal community of neurons that might be able to work together to create some sort of movement. Just acknowledging that cracks in these systems are the opportunities that we can look toward to kind of help transform what we're dealing with. And this idea of efficiency, I've always been very anti that concept. And we're so caught up in this reductionism, especially in the States these days, with the way that we approach complex issues to strip it down to the shortest, simplest, most reductive heuristic we can come up with, that we lose the plot. So I those are my comments. I mean, I'm curious what they fell in love with in the book. I want to pick up. Hopefully, they didn't fall in love with the zebra, but I'm intrigued by the idea of that book. Yeah.
Yeah, no, so thank you. So yeah, I agree with you. Just two comments. I really always try to be neutral. Say there's nothing wrong with reductionism. Actually, reductionism is fantastic. The point is it shouldn't be default, right? Is it has to be purposeful. Is for this problem, reductionism is the right thing. For this thing, I have to look through a complex systems lens. And so you have to, in a sense, the same's true for efficiency and resilience. I mean, some things we just have to make ridiculously efficient. That's okay, as long as we understand what the price is that you pay. And similarly on your example of neurons, I mean, there are images, and it may be a helpful image, but the fact is we actually share the same bacteria with dogs and chickens, but we don't share neurons with them because they are really separate systems. So there's a sort of discipline of in imagery we can do all sorts of things, but as a physicist I tend to be a little bit of fundamentalist, and you have to say, well, there are things that are separate, and you have to look at them separate, because it really helps you understand stuff. But yeah. Yeah, and the taxidermist falls in love with his assistant, by the way, but that's a...
Oh, okay.
I hope that's not giving away the end, but
not the main. I mean,
not
not the idea is not about the falling in love in reality, but a publisher will always come up with titles, and this one was pretty compelling, but it's what sells
catchy.
books.
A question on the fiction. Do you find people grasp the concepts better with stories? Or has it changed the way you teach or view complexity, perhaps?
No, I mean, I've been teaching, various things on complex systems for decades now. I even wrote a curriculum for high school kids and taught that at various schools for complexity for 15-year-olds who actually get it much more easily than adults. But I haven't found that, maybe I'm a poor teacher, right? But I haven't found the magical formula. In the end is, the coin drops with people or it doesn't. And you have to meander through stories, but actually also have some rigorous mathematics, or else people will just float in a set of stories. Because ultimately, what I found exciting about complexity science is that there is a scientific fabric, right? You can do mathematical modeling and complex network science and quantify things, which is an important part of how we engage and think about the world, right? Is heuristics matter, but just stories are not enough. I mean, the stakes are too high. You have to be able to debate and quantify things within reason. But so the science really matters, I think. It's a mix.
Could I make a quick comment on that point?
Of course.
Please, yeah, jump in, John.
Yeah, so I don't know if you're familiar with Roger Martin, the management strategist, but he introduced this concept in a Harvard Business Review article back in 2006 about reliability and validity. And this concept of designing in hostile territory was the name of the article. But it really spoke to kind of the MBA mindset versus the design thinkers or the creatives mindset. And that MBA mindset is always looking for something that can be proven, that it works, and that we can essentially double down on to generate income and profit and create from. So they're always trying to reduce to create more effectiveness, not effectiveness, but efficiency, I guess. Then on the other side, the creatives are focused on validity and multiple things that haven't been tried, things that aren't proven, and looking at this whole variety of ways that we might approach the future, approach business, and that there's a continuum between the two, and that each side needs to be able to speak each other's language or combine their thinking with this idea of reliability and validity. I'll drop the title in the chat. But I think there seems to be a corollary to what you're talking about, and I'm really fascinated by the discussion. So thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I tend to think of it, and I've written this in the first book, is that our choice of corporate structure, so the corporation, is optimized for efficiency and not adaptability, resilience, or learning. And that's a choice, but that's fine, right? And you just have to realize that companies will never be innovative. They can't be. So new people, setting up startups and new companies are are mostly innovative. But once they've settled into what they are, they're become one-trick ponies. And it isn't the people work there are idiots, right? They can be systems thinkers, but institutionally they can't. And so, for example, this whole debate about whether oil and gas companies should get into renewables and green stuff, my answer is hell no, right? They're absolutely incapable of doing that. They should just drill for oil and gas and return money to their shareholders who then invest it in other companies. And so we also have to be disciplined about that, institutions limit our options, right? We have institutions, and that if people want to be creative, they can't be inside a corporation because they're not intended to be creative. They're just not. And that's a choice, a collective choice we've made. And so the Darwinistic innovation is at the level of the economy and not at the level of the firm. And there are exceptions, right? Occasionally a company is able to innovate, but by and large, they tweak, right?
Just seems like Frederick Taylor and this approach of created the framework for the MBA and the business, and this Taylorism idea, we can't seem to rid ourselves of it.
But nor should we. It works, right? It's just
Does
we have
it?
to. Yes, but we have to get companies to die, right? So the thing is, then we have to be, you have to have corporate euthanasia, right? In a sense, is that we then want companies to survive, and you say no, they're institutions that serve a purpose for a time, and then they have to go away. And so this whole obsession with having steel companies convert to green steel, all this kind of stuff doesn't make any sense. They should just keep doing what they're doing, and then we should plan on they should be closed down, right? Just end of story. But politically, they have enormous power, and so that creates the dilemma. But they'll always be less efficient at innovation than a new company would be, and so why settle for the inefficiency, right?
Question on your related to complexity in the public policy. In there, you advocate for this activist laissez-faire, and so government setting these conditions rather than controlling the outcomes. In my personal work, so this is quite close to me, I'm working in aged care, and then we've just brought in a massive new aged care system based around legislation and therefore regulation. And in practice, regulators, regardless of the area, face enormous political pressure to be seen to be doing something, particularly after an adverse event. The real question here is, how do you protect that space for bottom-up adaptation when that political reality demands a visible top-down response?
So the first thing to note is that regulation can be catalytic, right? Because regulation can change the emergent behavior by making tweaks to the system architecture, which is different than regulation that wants every agent to have the same change.
Yeah, okay. Yep.
So regulation in itself you can have catalytic legislation, and the skill, I guess, is to be able to have that conversation amongst people, right? Is that amongst the people designing the legislation is, what's our theory of change? What's the structure of the system? What intervention are we trying to do? Are we trying to change the network structure? Are we trying to change the behavior of every agent in a uniform way? And so that's kind of the design conversation you need to have around that. But again, there are no absolutes about one being better than the other, because it really depends on the system. There are some things that that are quite absolute. But it's the quality of that conversation and finding some people who are systems literate enough that you can have that debate. And then I think you get to better designs. My sense is that, when it gets to the power dynamics, and that tends to be at such a coarse level that none of this almost plays, right? It tends to almost be like this big noise, a lot of and so there's actually quite a lot of space, I think, at the deep state level to design this stuff correctly. And sometimes you have to get lucky, etc. But a lot of the politics is so coarse that it doesn't get into that granularity. But you have to fight for it, right? Almost every week with this Methane Institute, I had to fight against people who wanted to go back to saying, no, but it's really about, we have to drive regulation and that's what's going to change the world. Companies can't be trusted. It has to be top down, etc. And I would say, yeah, that would be nice. But, in those countries where regulation might work, it's not, like the US. And in those countries, Algeria has fantastic methane regulation. And do you think anybody cares? They just go, well, we're the oil company. We don't need to follow the law. And so, the reality is much more sophisticated around these things. So it's really the ability to have the conversation in those systems terms. And I think, as you'll all know, there's a certainly loneliness about this until you find somebody who understands. At least that's my experience.
I got a question, Roland. I was wondering what your take is, because I like the word nonsensical. So what current or recent nonsensical movements do you see? What are they? And yeah, what would have helped towards more impact or designing correctly? I mean, a different design, different data point in these movements.
Well, I mean, obviously, artistic interventions matter a lot, right? Because and some of them are nonsensical. There's one which I admired particular is this. I don't know if you know this movement about birds aren't real. There's this guy in the US who's created this movement around the fact that the government has killed all the birds and replaced them with drones that are observing us. And it's clearly a spoof on conspiracy theories, but it's done at such a scale with so much humor that it really I think it's helpful, but it's a nonsensical movement, but it does expose things. And he's moved off of that, and he's bought the Enron brand for $250 at an auction. And look at the Enron website now, and he's relaunched the Enron brand with all sorts of very slick corporate videos about with the Asian chief technical officer in the turtleneck. I mean, the whole thing is just all these corporate cliches. It's just absolutely wonderful. And they finally launched a new product, which is called the Egg, which is a about this size nuclear power plant for the home. It'll power your home for 50 years. And these things, I think, matter. I mean, they're nonsense, but they're wonderful, and they're really strong commentary on what we do. So that, I think, the late night comment in the US, or maybe that's not what you mean. That's kind of the nonsense that I think matters a lot, because but does it reach enough people and does it have enough power? I don't know, but the world would be a lot less without it.
That's definitely true. But also, if you look at it to a more serious, like what movements such as, the return of the nuclear power plant discussion, things like that. I mean, and aren't there also some moves that are questionable in the design of the current approaches?
Yeah, I think they're an element of corruption to some extent, because you take the Netherlands in those, as the current government has decided that the Netherlands needs I don't know, 2 or 4 nuclear power plants. They're never going to get built because nuclear power is, ridiculously uneconomic and uncompetitive. But in the meantime, we're going to spend $500 million on engineering studies. And so there's this whole ecosystem of people who are going to make a fortune off the back of this stuff. And so I think it's a little bit more devious than that, right? Is that there are enough people who know that this doesn't make any sense, but it's a way of paying off certain sectors, is my guess. But, it's true. As I said, on climate policy, we pretty much know what to do, and it certainly doesn't include nuclear, but, and there's enough, proper, thoughtful studies that demonstrate that. But these things continue to happen, and the world's not perfect. So, yeah. Apologies if there are any nuclear enthusiasts on the call, but if you want to double your power bill, that's the way to go.
Or if you're an engineer, you might make a lot of money out of that.
That's true.
It's working the system, isn't it?
We should do R&D, right? We should continue to research, and maybe someday somebody will crack it. But for the moment, yeah, the Onion buying Infowars. Yeah, that's an interesting one to know. We'll see. I mean, it's hard to know how these things scale, or the influence of art and so on. But it matters a lot to the world, but not simple.
Picking up on just what you've just said then, the influence of art. Do you see creative or artistic approaches as important in complexity science, or in at least trying to get the message across around complexity?
I think so, in the sense that, it's the one great aha, I think, of complexity science is that it's a bit like, Wittgenstein 1, in a sense, for those who are familiar with it. But it shows that there are limits to our understanding, right? And it means that, whatever we do, there won't be more information. So the easy example is weather forecasting, right? We've kind of reached the limit of weather forecasting. We can forecast about 10 days out, and we know that it will never be 11 days because there's this chaotic drop off at that, or 12, whatever it is. And so understanding the limits of knowability of the world, of the complex world, is important. And yet we need to be able to engage with beyond those limits, because we have to navigate the world, right? And it's pretty clear, and some of the great programs, particularly US universities, have that. A great books program is absolutely critical, right? Is understanding, reading the great books is a way of developing an intuitive understanding of those areas that we know we will never scientifically be able to reach. And the boundary, we know a lot more about complex systems than we ever use, right? So it isn't about, let's just read poetry all day, but so there's a lot more to get out of, hard complexity science. But at the same time, we also know it will never give a full representation to the world. And is this whole debate about AI also, is that it's pretty clear that AI is kind of wonderful, shiny object. My car is, now fully self-driving since 2 weeks. I don't need to drive anymore, which is a wonderful application of AI. But Jesus, driving isn't exactly one of the world's, I don't need to operate my washing machine either, right? So it's kind of in that category. It's wonderful, but so what? But there's all these things, notably inventing and developing complexity science, right? Is you need to have sufficient, and I think the arts really matter there, to round out an education.
Joel, I've seen you jump on.
Yeah, I guess I want to just speak to that a little bit because I feel like perhaps there is no science without the arts, and many of these scientists from eons ago were also mystics in a sense and lived in a different kind of zeitgeist that, I don't know, didn't they were, it goes back to this kind of reductionist approach to things, that much of what these individuals represented got filtered out, and we ended up with the science and just the strict efficient approach to the information. So rewinding a bit and revisiting what some of these initial influences were for these incredible thinkers that we base much of our Western thought on, is probably a really valuable exercise to go a little bit deeper and to avoid some of these heuristics and biases that we talk about. So I see the humanities, the storytelling is so intrinsic to science that we can't have one without the other. And I want to see STEM as something that is inherently creative and that has ways for the arts and humanities to be baked into that. Because the more we reduce our learning to these antiquated systems of the university and so on and so forth in this world we're in now, the more we run the risk of, I guess, entropy and the path that we're on. And just here in the States, again, I mean, scarcity and competition and all for me, none for you is just, that's not systems thinking. And I don't know, when I think of the corporation being efficient, I also think, what are the externalities that we're not tracking that are causing the bigger issue with the bigger systems? So yes, they need to be efficient and do what they do, but what are the negative externalities that we're not tracking, like we track the cost of gas on the side of the road? And how is that creating the situation we're in? It's rhetorical, but I just wanted to pose that.
Yeah. Actually, externalities is one of those examples of concepts from equilibrium economics that's made it into language, right? It's fundamentally not to pick on you, but yeah. So, but I really, do believe in science, right? Is that there's, I don't know if you've seen it, the Santa Fe Institute just published an overview of the 100 foundational papers of complexity science, which is a 4,000-page book, commented papers, and these are highly technical, right? And this matters, right? Because in order, as Isak said, we need to have structured debate and proof about whether you need to be able to model complexity approaches, like my model of the eigenvector centrality of, all of these things. And so there isn't a contradiction between science and humanities at all. But we need to evolve science beyond reductionism. So non-reductionist science is absolutely possible. And it doesn't mean that it just becomes stories, right? You know, I'm a great believer in mathematics, right? Mathematics is infinitely more sophisticated than we use, and it, you know, can represent a lot about the world.
I'm not sure we have much. Well, we don't have much time left, and I'm not sure, Roland, if you have a very hard finish at.
I do, actually.
Yes, so I didn't want to ask any more questions, despite my temptation to. But I just wanted to thank you very much for the time you've put into today and your generosity in answering such a wide variety of questions without notice. It's been fantastic. I've really learned a lot. I've been looking forward to this for many weeks now. So appreciate your time.
And it's super. It's always wonderful to have these kinds of discussions. And, you know, in the end, there aren't that many people who engage.
Yeah.
As much.
Sadly, yes. But it's picking up, I'd say, hopefully. But, if just for the participants, just very, very briefly, if you could rate from 1 to 10 the utility of this session, that'd be wonderful. It will help us with other similar sessions, how useful it was to you and your reality, your context, 10 being the best, 1 being the worst. But we have another session coming up on collective intelligence, which is a series we've been running, which will be, there'll be more news on that in a couple of weeks. So keep an eye out on the Governance Hub on Systems Innovation or LinkedIn, wherever you get that information. But thank you very much. Just focusing on finishing before the hour so you can get away, Roland. Appreciate your time.
Super. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Isaac.
Thank you. See you, Martin.
Good luck tonight.
Yeah, thanks.
Have coffee.
I'm going to get one now.
Okay, awesome, man.
Well.